All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. This is our second open forum Q&A webinar, part of a series ARVC is hosting every Monday and Thursday, a chance for you to get your questions answered by our panel of experts. As we have been doing, we're going to give it just a couple of minutes to get everybody who wants to join an opportunity to log in. I see the number climbing pretty quick here, so we'll get started in about 30 seconds. As participants are coming online, though, I want to start by reminding everyone that we are updating our information hub at arvc.org/coronavirus multiple times each day with new resources and up-to-the-minute updates as soon as we have them. You can also download and listen to our previous webinars, which I'm thrilled to say have seen more than 1,400, last I checked, views on YouTube. We aren't going to get to every question today, as we have in the past webinars as well, but we're posting answers to those questions that we don't cover specifically on each webinar. So your questions today, if they don't get answered, don't worry. We are passing those on to our panelists. They're getting us answers back, and then we're posting those on the information hub as well. And again, that's arvc.org/coronavirus. I also want to remind everyone of a couple of great tools on that page. One is the reputation management tool that is free and an easy way of keeping a pulse on comments about your business on social channels and a way to communicate with campers and potential campers. This tool again is free, and it's brought to you by Insider Perks, our panelist Brian Searl and ARVC. And another one is you can also create a customized emergency plan and access a host of templates using the Disaster Hawk app, brought to you by Hytropy and our panelist, Patrick Hardy. You can access both of those tools on arvc.org/coronavirus as well. So before I introduce everyone on today's panel, I'm going to kick it over to Jacqueline Gloria on the ARVC team for some quick instructions for how you will be submitting your questions today. It hasn't changed if you've joined us before. If you're new, though, just give you a couple of quick instructions. Jack?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. As we go through today's call, if you have a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom center of your Zoom window. If you see a question that somebody else has asked and it's a topic that you're also interested in, you can hit the like or the thumbs up icon, and that'll help float that question to the top of the list. Also, the chat and the raise hand features have been disabled. David?
All right, thanks, Jack. With that out of the way, I'd like to just do some quick introductions of our panelists today. And again, if you've joined us before, we have a similar panel. We have panelists today that are experts in marketing, legal, business and finance, insurance, and advocacy. And I believe we will have Patrick Hardy on this call. Patrick, I don't know if you've joined us yet or not, but
I have.
Excellent. All right, cool. So we have Patrick with kind of the emergency planning side of things as well. So real quick introductions. Jeff Sims is our expert answering questions on ARVC's advocacy efforts on today's panel. Jeff is ARVC's Senior Director of State Relations and Program Advocacy and has been working with legislators and lobbyists in Washington and at the state level on behalf of our industry for more than a decade. He's also a former campground owner and chairman of ARVC. Our business and finance expert on the panel today who can answer questions on SBA loans and the like is Paul Bosley, founder of Business Finance Depot. Paul established this company in 2006 and has taught financing, budgeting, and various courses at ARVC's National School and OHCE, and has also volunteered with the SBA, so he knows a lot about the SBA. Our emergency planning expert again today is Patrick Hardy. Patrick is CEO of Hytropy.com leading disaster management company in our industry. He's a certified emergency manager and risk manager, and also has extensive experience working with properties from coast to coast. So he knows our industry well. We have two insurance experts with us today: Chris Hipple from Leavitt Recreation and Hospitality Insurance, and Irene Jones from Marshall and Sterling. Both are ARVC Supplier Council members. Chris is a 25-year veteran of the commercial industry, insurance industry, and focuses on the needs of our RV park and campground industry nationwide. He holds a commercial insurance counselor degree and has also been a speaker and educator at ARVC events. And Irene is also a 25-year veteran of the industry, and she leads Marshall and Sterling's campground insurance program and is known for her Marshall and Sterling Press Play video series, which you may have seen out there. She speaks nationally on insurance and risk management for campgrounds. Covering marketing, we have Brian Searl and Mark Koep. Brian is CEO of Insider Perks, full-service digital agency providing marketing and advertising services for our industry. He's worked with more than 200 campgrounds across the country. And Mark is the founder and CEO of Campground Views. He's a ARVC Supplier Council member focusing on making camping trips amazing for campers and also for campground owners. As a virtual entrepreneur, he and his family have spent the last 8 years traveling in their RV, and so he has a unique experience out there on the road and is an expert in marketing and communicating the RV lifestyle. And finally, our legal expert today is Christine Taylor, and we have Christine on the call for the first half as well, like we did last time. So we'll push the legal questions out first if we can. Christine is an associate attorney at Towne, Ryan and Partners in Albany, New York, and focuses her practice in hospitality, business, and labor and employment law. And she has a unique experience as well because her family has owned 3 campgrounds from her childhood through the present day. So she has a good insight on our industry, both from the legal and campground owner perspectives. So we have a great panel today, and we've already got 9 questions in already. So we're going to get started leading off with our panel here. Let me see what the most popular question is. If a camper leaves and later contracts COVID-19, are we required to notify our guests? What are the requirements? That might be one for you, Patrick, maybe even a little bit for our marketing panel, if you guys want to jump in on it.
Actually, before I start, what I'd like to hear Christine's perspective first on the legal end of it, and then I'm happy to jump in as well because I have an opinion from an emergency management perspective, but I'd love to hear the legal side first, if that's okay.
That's a good idea. Christine, you want to tackle this one?
Sure. So as they've been notifying most people to do, I apologize if my internet's a little weird right now, is to contact your local health department for direction on how they want to handle it. Before that ever happens, you kind of want to maybe check in and see what happens, and again, have a policy of what you're going to do. I'd say legally, follow what the State Department suggests. It's going to be hard to trace back, but if you do find out, for example, in my office building, before we were work from home, we had a case. So the office building had to notify every person who was in that building that there was a possible, transmission and that we should quarantine. But you're really going to want to contact your health department and see what they suggest for that and follow that to a T. That will help decrease your liability.
And from an emergency management perspective, I agree with that entirely. In fact, one of the things that we've said is that public health now have people who are available where if you have a COVID positive response to your property, there are people that literally their entire job is to advise folks who have a COVID positive response in their business. So they actually have various industries, and of course the guidance is changing on an almost daily basis. I mean, when I was talking to some folks out in Arizona, the Department of Public Health, in fact, they actually changed their guidance twice in one day. So it's rapidly evolving, but I think Christy's absolutely right, which is I think that you have to reach out to them. But the main thing I want to emphasize, I know we talked about last time, is, and I really want to make sure it's very clear, which is make sure that you should have a written policy in place about this so that you are creating consistency in application, because if you do that, I think it limits any other issues you may have from guests in your park.
I think from a marketing standpoint, it's more of a public relations play as far as avoiding people leaving a review or leaving a public comment and saying that you did this or making that accusation that impacts future business down the road. And so from a park owner's perspective, kind of maybe do what you would want somebody to do for you if you were at a hotel. And also take into account the situation. Was the guest isolated in their rig, or were they participating in an activity because you still had that? Or did they go to the pool because your pool was still open? And so case by case basis, but I think avoiding the public relations end of it is more of a concern than worrying about marketing, if that makes sense.
Okay. Another legal question, Christine. Do you have to pay employees if you send them home, or if they were exposed to someone that had symptoms and you're not letting them come back to work?
Okay, so this is going to be the interplay between state and federal law. You might have to pay them. There is the Federal Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act that is going into effect as of April 2nd that requires you to pay up to 80 hours of paid sick time for qualifying reasons. And just to not be incredibly boring, but to give a little bit of an overview, those reasons can include things such as being subject to a federal, state, or local quarantine or isolation order related to COVID-19, that you were advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine, that you're experiencing symptoms and seeking a medical diagnosis, that's symptoms of COVID-19, that you're caring for an individual who had one of those things happen to them, or even that you're caring for your son or daughter if their school is closed and you can't work from home. There's a couple other ones, but I guess what I'm saying is that you really might implicate paid sick leave laws under these new federal laws, depending if it falls under one of these things. So you're gonna have to pay attention. And even if you didn't have an internal policy first for paying sick leave, you might now be under one based on these federal laws, because that particular law actually applies to people with less than 500 employees. They say there's going to be an exception for those who have less than 50 employees if it would create an economic hardship to pay that sick leave, but we haven't gotten the exact way that you necessarily prove that yet. They said if you're going to claim that exemption, that you should keep paperwork that shows why that would create an economic instability of your business. But I'd be very careful and consult an attorney, because that's just the federal piece. For example, New York has their own paid sick leave law. So you're gonna wanna consult an attorney before you send somebody home and refuse to allow them to work.
So Christine, where would, on a state-by-state basis, where would you suggest people go to find that information?
So for New York, for example, it was contained within one of our executive orders. So it's going to be dense and it might be hard to interpret, but I'd start by looking at your governor's executive orders. And then some very nice labor and employment law firms have been putting out alerts for their specific states that they cover that kind of summarize some of that. The other thing, if you want to look at the federal level, the Department of Labor, the US Department of Labor, has a really nice FAQ that they've been updating on there. So like yesterday when I looked, they had put some more information about the expanded leave requirements and how it would apply to you and stuff like that. So those would be the good places to start. I guess generally the Department of Labor websites for your state and federal would be good places to start. Then look at governor orders and try to piece it together yourself.
Okay. So the governor orders, just so everyone knows, the governor orders for every state are on the information hub at arvic.org/coronavirus. There's a state-specific section. and you can click on, it's the second link in the list, and there's a spreadsheet in there that shows every state by state, every executive order, every closure order. It goes into great detail there, so you may find what you need there. And then after this call, I'll work with Christine to get the links to those various places that she mentioned up there as well, so you have those.
To mention from a positive perspective, at least in the federal one, if you're required to pay that sick leave, there are tax credits that you'll get, like reimbursement for paying that leave. So it could end up, working out for you at the end. Like might have to front the cost up front, but it could help you later down the road. So there is a little bit, I guess, of a positive there if you get stuck under that.
Okay, so the next question that we've got is for Paul Bosley, our SBA expert. The question is, there was a conference call with regional SBA administrators yesterday that I guess some of our participants joined in on. And they, on that call, recommended that small businesses apply for disaster loans even if they are not sure they want to accept the funds ultimately. Would you agree that this is a good strategy while campgrounds are figuring out their reduced cash flow?
Yes, I would generally agree with that. The call yesterday was oh geez, they did it again. I can't believe every time I answer a question, somebody calls me. That call took place before the Senate passed the bill last night. So there is now that the bill has passed the Senate, it's going over to be voted on the House tomorrow. There's a whole different loan program that's being voted on and then hopefully signed into law by the end of the week. But I would say that advice is good advice. It's going to take a couple hours for somebody to apply. I think I mentioned in the last call that just as a matter of principle, I decided to apply myself because I knew people were going to be asking me questions about it. So last Sunday, during 60 Minutes, when I figured the world's watching about what's going on, I applied and I got through the process. And I got an email yesterday saying that my account's in underwriting. So, they are being somewhat responsive. So if you think about it, I applied on Sunday. They probably didn't even get the file till Monday. And Wednesday, I get something back that they're in underwriting. My advice would be, yeah, I think that is good advice. But based on what I'm seeing, there's a whole new loan program now that we can talk about at another time in a later question, maybe.
So I'd actually like to jump in on this. I have spent the last, I'd probably say 6 hours looking at the Senate bill. My only caution would be that the new program that you're talking about, if you have applied for the other disaster loan, you won't necessarily be able to apply for the new loan because they are barring you from receiving both loans, and you have to certify that you don't have another pending loan application that's going to cover the same like payroll expenses, etc. So I would just caution that there might be a preclusion if you get the one loan that the other one might be unavailable based on the bill text.
That's true. SBA for years has had a rule that you can't have more than one SBA loan within a 90-day period.
Is there an advantage to one over the other for members of our industry, Paul?
Well, the disaster loan is up to $2 million. It's a 3.75% rate. There's no fees involved. It's a direct loan application with the SBA. What I'm reading, I've taken the Wall Street Journal article online and I've copied it, which I'll send to you after this call, into different categories. And for the small business category, because there was a very in-depth online article in the Wall Street Journal online about what's in the Senate bill. And based upon what I'm seeing, these loans are going to be processed instead of directly by the SBA, by SBA approved lenders, which will mean that there will be some types of fees that the lenders charge. It doesn't say anything about the interest rates at all. So the concept behind the
interest rate would be 4%. The difference between the one loan and the other is that the new loan they're proposing has 8 weeks of loan forgiveness built into it.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing about it is, so what did you say the interest rate you read was what?
4%. And it's a
Okay, so-
max 10-year term, but that's only for the part of your loan that isn't forgiven based on the 8 weeks of loan forgiveness.
Right. The interesting thing about the new loan is that they convert the grants at some point based upon the person that gets the loan, the company that gets the loan, continuing to pay their help. So the main concept, the underlying concept of the new loan that's being proposed is that you keep your help and you keep paying your help so that people don't go on to unemployment. So that's the underlying concept of this other loan.
That's true.
Okay.
There's also a forgiveness provision that if you already laid people off and then you allow you rehire them, that they won't penalize you for having laid people off, because there's a reduction based on if you laid people off already.
That's correct.
I have a feeling that this is going to, I mean, this is an ongoing thing, obviously, since it's being batted around on the Hill and it hasn't even been approved yet. So the sources that we have on an industry call that I was on this morning were pointing to approval by the end of the week. So hopefully we will have some clarity by that point, and then on Monday's call we'll be able to give a little bit more detail into what next steps should be on that front. I'm going to switch gears a little bit because we've got a really popular question about sanitizing supplies, which I know is bound to be a hot issue with everybody as we're trying to keep up with CDC cleaning guidelines around the country. It's a two-part question. I'm going to answer the first part, and then the second part, Patrick, I'm going to send over to you. The first part is, how are we supposed to get sanitizing supplies when everywhere you try says not in stock? I will commit on this call, after we get off of the webinar, I'm going to reach back out to our suppliers. We have Staples, Office Max, Office Depot, and HD Supply. I'm going to reach out to all of them and make sure that this is still the case. But as of yesterday, late yesterday, sanitizing supplies as well as other supplies, toilet paper, paper towels, those kinds of things, were all still available through those links that you can find on the ARVC website that are direct links for ARVC members to get not only the supplies that you need, but also at a discount. And those companies are also waiving all of their shipping costs and no order minimum whatsoever. But like I said, I will double check to make sure that that is still the case. Now, granted, even though they're in stock, those companies, by order of federal and state governments, are giving priority to those on the front lines, hospitals and first responders. But like I said, as of yesterday, we were hearing from those providers that our members could still purchase those types of supplies through those links. So I will update. We have a link on the arvc.org/coronavirus page that goes to those, and I will make sure that that's updated today after we hear back from them. The second part to the question, Patrick, is what do parks do when they don't have staff or supplies to comply with CDC or other expert cleaning recommendations?
If you don't have the people to do it, then you're going to have to reevaluate your operations and decide what your main priorities are going to be. Because if you can't disinfect certain areas according to CDC, you're going to have to close it, and that's going to be a tough choice to make. And in fact, we know a number of companies. This actually happens quite often in like the salon industry, where they have very strict hygiene standards. And when they can't maintain them because they had to lay off staff because, people aren't coming in, there's only a certain number of people who can be in the salon at any one time, they call us and ask us, and we say, well, ultimately, if you can't do it, you're going to have to close. Because if you can't follow the guidelines, it opens you up to a number, and I'm not an attorney, but I'm sure they would open you up to legal issues as far as from an emergency preparedness perspective. The other problem that it creates is if you decide to remain open, if you say, listen, I have to do this, I have to remain open. The problem is that if you end up having an outbreak at the park, if you end up putting a policy that you can't enforce, then that's going to not only make you look bad, but it's going to create an operational problem because people are going to ask you, well, you said, you're going to, like, for example, I had a park up north in Washington State, and they called us and they said, well, we had an issue, with the park because we were telling people we were able to disinfect the laundry room once an hour. And then we had people who were out there and they noticed that no one had been in there for 2 hours. And they called us and said, why aren't people, going in there? I thought you guys were going to be doing this every hour. So that starts to create an issue of they think that the policies that you're promulgating, the ones that you're trying to universally apply, aren't ones that are actually going out there. So when you guys are putting up your disaster plans, when you're putting up your flyers, whatever you're doing, whatever you're communicating, whatever operational modifications you are making to the park, if you can't enforce them or if you don't have the supplies, then you're going to have to make some very tough choices because you really don't want to get into the slippery slope of, well, I may not have the supplies, but you know what? I got to remain open because I have to do this or I have to do that. That just really isn't feasible, and it causes a lot of it'll cause operational problems down the road, and especially if you're put into a situation where someone gets sick and later on they find out that you knew way in advance that you didn't have the supplies and you didn't have the personnel, but you decided to go ahead anyway.
This is Chris Hipple. I had read an article on this and I saw this question come up, so I did a little quick research on the CDC website. And apparently Everclear grain alcohol is 95% alcohol, and I did go to the CDC website, and that is a sanitizer. Now, I didn't dive into the article deep enough to read on what it's effective for, how you're supposed to use it, or anything else like that, but there could be alternative solutions to at least getting surface sanitizers. They advise not to make your own hand sanitizer out of it.
Yeah, that could be flammable. The other thing I'll add to it as well is I know ARVC is working with a vendor that usually produces bug repellent to create, and they're getting ready to start producing hand sanitizer at their facility instead of the bug repellent. And we're in talks with them right now to get them set up for as a supplier for hand sanitizer that hopefully will be coming in the next couple of weeks, which doesn't answer the solution now, but it will hopefully down the road. Patrick, I want to ask a quick follow-up question that's of a similar nature. How often would you recommend sanitizing bathrooms in the overnight hours, like from 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. when a campground might have limited staff?
Well, when the guidance, the FEMA and CDC guidance are a little bit different. It really depends on traffic. It depends on the number of people at your park. What I generally like to say is, I like to keep very consistent hours so that people know that you're going in there on a routine basis. So what we tell people is we say every couple of hours. If you do it once an hour during the day, at night, once every couple of hours, just have somebody check and go in there. If it hasn't been touched, you know, if it hasn't been used, you know, it's different. But one of the things that we were talking about last time, and one of the reasons why this question is a complex one in some sense, is because some parks have a lot of bathrooms in them, right? So it becomes very difficult for them to travel. So what we tell people is we say, listen, if you can't keep a routine for every bathroom, then you need to close certain bathrooms so that you're only using a certain number of them, so that you're not trying to sanitize every single one, because this problem becomes a serious issue, especially for larger parks. You know, we have parks that have, you know, they're hundreds of acres wide, and it's like, you know, they can't go to every single one throughout the evening. So what we tell people is we say limit the number of bathrooms so that you're not stretching your people too thin, and you're not stretching your supplies too thin as well, because otherwise you're going to have to keep doing it, because you don't know who may have used it and gone in there. So I think if you limit it from an operational perspective, and in your disaster planning, again, I want to go back to this, that when you start to think through your disaster plans, you have to say, okay, operationally, I'm not going to be able to run as normal. So what can I ultimately do to make sure that I'm not stretching my staff too thin? But I will say this, which is, I say, we recommend every couple of hours, but what I do say is that make sure that the routine is maintained no matter what. So don't put up anything that's too aggressive and then not be able to follow through. But if I receive additional CDC guidance on it, which I've actually asked one of our FEMA reps about this, as soon as I get information, you guys will be the first to find out. So because we're asking various partners about what best practices are for right now. So.
Excellent. Thank you, Patrick. I'm going to jump back over to legal. We had a follow-up question on the previous SBA question as well, in terms of what the definition of loan forgiveness is. What exactly does that mean for our members in this particular situation, either Paul or Christine or both?
So from what I've read, and again, we don't really know yet, as saying this goes to the House tomorrow at 9 a.m. So this one isn't final, whereas the economic injury disaster loan is something that's already in effect. But the new loan that they're now considering, there would be loan forgiveness, that they would be eligible for loan forgiveness equal to the amount of certain expenses spent during an 8-week period after the origination date of the loan. Those expenses include things like payroll costs, interest payments on secured debt that had come into effect before February 15th, payment of rent or lease that had been in effect prior to February 15th, and payments for utilities that had been in effect for the 15th. So they would forgive the amount of the loan in that 8-week period that covered those expenses. Again, it's not finalized yet, but that's the forgiveness that they are considering.
Yeah, final or not, though, I think the important thing to reiterate, we've said this before on previous webinars, is document, right?
Yeah, I mean, always. And I mean, honestly, we should have a pretty good idea. Granted, it might be 2 a.m. Saturday morning, but since everybody is trying to push this along, the Senate stayed for some late nights this week to get it approved. So we're hoping the House does the same. And then the president has said that he plans to sign it in what iteration it comes. He liked the current iteration. So we're all hoping what the bill text is now is what we see in the end.
Okay, great.
I can add a little more color to that, David, if you'd like.
Yeah, go ahead, Paul.
Christine, you know, we're all learning as we go here, but we're on a call every morning with RVIA and RVDA leadership, and their government affairs vice president, a guy named Jay Landers, just reported that the House looks like it's going to stumble a bit. They were hoping for what's called a unanimous consent, meaning everybody calls in from their home and it's approved, but there are folks that are offering resistance now, and it's looking like it's going to be a voice vote, which requires all the House representatives to come back to DC and then vote. So it may be more than a few days to get resolved. And that's unfortunate, but that is the latest from Washington, DC as of this morning.
It does not actually surprise me, because even my own state governor wasn't exactly happy with the contents of the bill, because it includes state aid that they're giving. So I know some people are still complaining about the amounts. Unfortunately, it's all wrapped up at 880 pages together. So we're stuck at the mercy of their interpretation.
Christine, I know you're a lawyer, but I'm still impressed that you read 880 pages in 6 hours.
Maybe you guys have already covered this. I'm sorry if you haven't. I just joined, but I guess it's intuitive to everybody that there's going to be a mad rush for these grants and loans through the SBA, and we're hearing that the SBA is trying to staff up. But we all know government bureaucracy can be slow. So the encouraging word here is that if you are going to apply, do it quickly. Do it very quickly. Get yourself in the queue so that you don't get backed up with all the others that are going to be in line.
I'd like to just comment on that. The disaster loan goes directly to the SBA, but the indication that I'm getting from the Wall Street Journal article, which was a lot less than Christine read, is that these loans are going to be handled through SBA lenders, which makes a lot.
That's correct, Paul. Yeah, that is contained in the bill text, and they actually, as part of the bill, have a policy on how to authorize even additional lenders. I think that they are planning on it to be quite, busy. So they are fast tracking, letting more people lend as well, if this iteration is the one that is accepted.
Thanks
All right,
for that.
Christine, I'm going to stick with you on this next question, and it came from two different people, so I'm going to kind of blend it together. But can we legally require a hold harmless in order to gain access? In other words, can campground owners have people sign anything having to do with the virus as they come in to allow them to be legally less liable?
Okay, so this is kind of twofold. You can have them sign whatever you want. Will it actually protect you? Probably not. I mean, generally with releases and waivers, you have to be very careful about what the contents of that release and waiver are. Again, very state specific. In fact, some states are so specific that they want certain text bold and capitalized. So you'll have to be very careful for that. Can I guarantee? Well, obviously there's no guarantees in law that it'll do anything to protect you down the line if someone wants to sue you. The best case scenario is it shows that they chose to come into your park even after you made them aware of the risk. And in which case you can help use that as your defense. Does it prevent a lawsuit or make it automatically be dismissed? That's very unlikely. So my suggestion would be you can absolutely have signs or have them have something to sign. Again, as long as you make everybody sign the same thing. Try to make it as close to what your state requires for general releases and waivers. Give them time to read it. And then if they assume that risk on their own, that does provide you a better defense in the event you do get sued, but it won't actually stop you from getting sued.
Christine, do most states provide templates for those types of waivers? Or is that something
No.
that campground owners would have to get from a lawyer?
Yeah, I mean, I would generally consent a lawyer. You could probably do some research to find it. Some state associations have some nice stuff, but it is pretty state specific. I can say the most general rules are you have to be very clear. You have to show everybody what they're signing. They have to know what they're signing. So if there's a new provision, like say you put it in a waiver you already had, you'd want to point out to people like, this is new, this is different. Because always the best offense to these kind of things is that you didn't know what you were signing and they didn't give you a chance to understand it. So generally it should be clear. They should have the time to read it from that perspective. But there are, again, specific state things. I mean, in New York, for example, you can have that waiver, but it's not going to do much for you because technically we're not allowed to do waivers with payment for recreational activities. So there's just, you know, there's intricacies, but you can start with something general that's clear to allow people to see.
Christine, I have a question on that. If you have a waiver that is in force at your campground that's been vetted through the state attorney, et cetera, and then you add like new rules for operating under COVID-19, which might include we follow the current requirements of state and local and national health and government, and then you attach those rules to the waiver, and there's something in your waiver that says I agree to abide by the campground rules, including all new rules. Would that be, I know that would be a hold harmless, but would that be something that would be sensible? Okay.
Yeah, that's not a terrible idea. I mean, when we draft seasonal license and things like that, we always leave a provision that we're allowed to edit it at a later time and subject to new rules, state laws, et cetera. So that is something you could attach. Again, I'd make sure that you absolutely make sure that it is very clear and they have a chance to know what they're agreeing to. Yeah.
This is Chris. If you're going to have them sign those things, and especially if you're going to attach a list of rules that they're supposed to follow and you're supposed to follow, you better make sure you're following those rules.
That's true. All right, so unfortunately that kind of wraps it up for me. I have to go take a client call, but it was nice speaking again, and I will check in again in the future.
Thanks for joining us, Christine. Hopefully you'll be able to join us on Monday, and I'll send you any legal questions after this that we can get answered and posted. Thanks.
Sounds great, thanks.
We're getting a lot of questions this morning about the SBA stuff. Likely because of what's in the news. So with the bill on the Hill. So I'm going to pose this one to you, Paul, on a personal financial statement for the SBA. Should we use current information, or is 12/31/19 okay, despite the huge changes in the stock market?
Well, when you submit a personal financial statement, you put a date at the top, and you report it at where your assets and liabilities are at that particular date. So generally speaking, the SBA and the lenders that we work with will take a personal financial statement that's current within 90 days. So I think it's really just a matter of what date that the applicant decides to use. So at this point, I would say realistically that it should be dated some date this year. Whether it's February 15th or whatever date that they have current information so that they can record it.
Okay, great. Jeff Sims, this question is for you. It's an advocacy question. What is being done to lobby governors to consider campgrounds as essential?
Well, we're involved in multiple arenas along with our coalition partners. Paul Bamby, ARVC president, has sent letters to all governors, along with we are working in tandem with multiple state associations, and also in contact with individual parks and states that don't have associations, providing them guidance and direction on getting the campgrounds and RV parks listed as essential businesses.
I would add to that too that on the information hub that I've mentioned before, arvic.org/coronavirus, there's a whole section on advocacy, and you can see each of the letters that Jeff referenced that ARVC and industry partners have sent. There's, I believe, at least 6 to 8 things listed under there that are specific action that ARVC and state associations have taken on this essential business piece. Paul, Bambi, you got anything that you'd like to add to that?
Well, you know, one of the things that we feel very strongly about from the ARVC Denver perspective is giving a campground member a voice. And by that I mean being able to send a letter to any level of government, whether it's federal, state, county, or city. So having said that, we are also trying to work very closely with our partnering state executives. And this is a touchy subject because many of those state executives have been very successful in tampering down the mandates that have come out from the governor's office or even the county or city. So to send a letter at this juncture from a member and giving them a voice might be a voice that state executive thinks could be disruptive. So it's a state-by-state situation. We're working with them as best we can. And our goal is to try and give every member who wants to have a voice a chance to do that. But again, it's got to be couched. We don't want disruption in states that feel like things are moving pretty well right now.
All right. This next question is a specific to emergency plans. So Patrick, this one's yours. When writing our COVID-19 procedures, when having a guest test positive, we have different types of guests. One, seasonals using their RV as their permanent residence, seasonals using their RV as a second residence, and transients here for just a short time. Should we have 3 different guidelines? What are your recommendations on that?
What I would recommend is a unified policy. So even though you may have a variety of different kinds of campers at your park, what we would recommend is one unified policy, because one of the things that we've talked about over and over again is ensuring that there is a uniformity of application of the policies that you have in place. And so when we talk to parks about having a COVID-19 response, what's going to happen is that if that were to occur, people are going to wonder how you reacted to one and why you may have changed it to another. So, you know, why you may have applied one standard for one kind of camper versus another standard for somebody else. If you have that universal application, particularly if you have that mixture, then people are going to look to you. And it's really, from an emergency management perspective, it is best when you can when you don't have to do a lot of explaining as to why you're doing certain things. If everybody knows, hey, this is the policy, this is the reason why we're doing it this way, then what it does is it ensures that people are going to follow it a lot more closely, and that they will realize that the policies that you have implemented are serious, and that they are being they're not being arbitrarily applied to certain kinds of campers or others. So this is simply from and I'm sure it's also from a marketing perspective too, and I'm sure either Brian or Mark will hop in on this, which is when you have, well, the other issue too is actually from emergency management is that public health is going to ask you, if you have applied 3 different standards to 3 different kinds of campers, public health may ask you why it is that you're applying a different standard to everybody. So my perspective is, for simplicity's sake, for the simplicity of your staff, because you don't have a lot of time to train these folks on this, it's better to just have one policy. It's easily applied, and you're able to tell your staff, you know, no matter what happens, matter who it is, if you have just this one policy in place, it makes it so much easier for everybody to be able to use. But you know, from our perspective, that's really the simpler your plan is, the better it's going to end up being.
Mark and Brian, do you have any thoughts on how to communicate that policy?
This is Mark. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay, perfect. In communicating any sort of policy, post it wherever you possibly can. So obviously your primary place is going to be somewhere on your website. I know a lot of folks have already created a unique page on their website. So depending on the tools, you can create a blog post or a page, whatever. Just create one centralized source on your website where you're posting all these rules, and add a note on there that these rules are subject to change, and that this one page will be the place where you update that content, and then share that page via email, via social media, via every avenue you possibly have to communicate it. So all it is getting that word out there that this one spot is the place for that information. So to that point, you know, there's a tendency to copy paste. So you paste onto Facebook what you post on your website. The risk you run there is that if you then change your rules on your website and forget to copy and paste to Facebook, now you've got outdated rules on Facebook, which will create confusion and problems going forward.
Brian, does the reputation management tool help in what Mark just described in terms of getting the same communication out on channels?
Not really. I mean, the reputation tool is more for monitoring what people are already saying about you on the internet as far as comments and things like that. So okay. I think I agree with most of what he's saying. Just having one centralized location for updates is probably the safest bet to keep track of it and be consistent. But
can I ask a follow-up question too, Brian, on that? Hey, Brian, are you seeing any negative reviews being written on parks that are utilizing your tools specifically in relation to all this?
Mostly about cancellation policy so far, people not being flexible, which, you know, no judgment here. Your policy is your policy, but yeah, that's mostly what's coming in right now is I'm trying to cancel and either can't get a hold of somebody or somebody told me no or won't waive the fee or says it's non-refundable, or so that's what's coming in so far. I know that just to add something too, David had emailed me a question after the last webinar about people coming in and saying, well, another park has this open, why don't you? And so that's something we foresee too, as reviews start to come in, is you know, why is that playground open that I stopped at in the last state and why is yours closed? And so that may be something to just prepare for too.
What's the advice that you guys can give on that if someone is confronted with that question?
No, I had a really good answer to the question, David. I don't remember what I said though. I think it's just, you know, the health and safety of our guests is the most important thing, and it's a case-by-case basis, and just playing off. I mean, obviously, there's a whole disconnect. Federal has some guidelines, state has some, local has some, and so just using that to your advantage, not to your advantage. It's a terrible thing to say, but I mean, the health and safety is the biggest thing, and just understanding that, you know, we're doing our best to follow CDC guidelines and interpret them the best way we can, and so we understand your frustration, but this is why we're doing it.
Yeah, and we're seeing
every community is different, right?
Exactly, and we're seeing, you know, we're seeing self-proclaimed sheriffs calling up folks and trying to enforce the rules that aren't even, you know, they're just general members of the public. And so this goes to all the policies, procedures. You need to understand why you're making your rules and what decisions you're making, and then stand by those decisions and make sure they're backed in some sort of reality. So, you know, your local health department said X, Y, Z. Here's what we're doing to comply with that, and here's why, because that'll help push back on some of this. That's going on. And I think over time, probably over the next 2 weeks, you'll start to see this taper off. But definitely over the next week, you're going to see more and more pushback from the general public, and especially as frustrations mount. If this shutdown continues much beyond Easter, you're really going to see an overall pushback from the public, and that's going to manifest itself in a number of different ways that we really can't predict as of yet, because people will start to get frustrated, and they'll start taking that frustrations out on various people. So park owners, especially when you start thinking about your summer bookings, that's where you'll start to see pushback if we go beyond Easter and the shutdowns are continuing, because people are really going to start having money issues and all that other stuff. So obviously that's a conversation we'll have in the future depending on where things go, but just be aware that folks are really stressed right now. They're really worried, and you're just an easy target for them to take it out on. So if you've got a policy, cancellation policy that's a little bit harsh, just be ready for the pushback or adjust it accordingly to avoid that pushback.
Mark,
So,
this is Irene.
Go ahead, Irene.
I'm sorry, I was going to jump in. I think it's really important for people to communicate with their guests when they check in. What's going on in your state, for example, or in your region. For example, in New York, to use a playground example, in New York, under the Essential Services Order, you're not allowed to have your playground open. So if you've come in from a different state, if you communicate that to people, this is what's going on right now, this is how things are, it's all clearly marked, it may change, we'll update you, we're all in this together, we appreciate your help. I think we need to repeatedly say, campers, please do your part. This is part of what's going on, because it's so different it's a big country. It's so different in different parts of the country. So remember, by the 20th time you say it, it's going to be frustrating for you as a campground owner, but remember to stay compassionate and teach them about what's going on and invite them to be part of the solution. And I think that will be key to helping keep the tone of community at the campground.
I agree with that. And also add, at this point in time and for the next 2 weeks leading up to Easter, if you're a park, even if you're not in one of these shutdown areas, if you're a park that has community areas that are still open, you're not doing anybody a favor. I would recommend, wherever you're at in this country, and this is my recommendation, not ARVC, just my personal recommendation from a marketing standpoint, that no matter where you are in the country, if you've got public areas that are still open, I recommend shutting them down up until Easter as we get through this, because all you're doing is opening yourself up to a whole bunch of backlash potential. If somebody gets sick, if somebody spreads it there, it's just good advice at this point in time to shut down those public areas.
Okay, so we have a follow-up question, I think, for our marketers as well, in terms of communicating to guests. For cancellation of reservations that were made prior to the pandemic, what are the dangers other than reputational of changing your refund policy and not returning deposits made?
Well, so that's the answer from a marketing standpoint. The other answer is probably a question that's better posed to Christine, who's unfortunately off the call legal-wise. But I did have a phone call with Amy Wirtz, who does some legal consultation for campgrounds the other day, specific to some parks, asking me this question. And so there are answers. I don't know that I'm comfortable giving them as far as legal advice goes. But I think that the biggest thing is avoiding that from a reputation standpoint as far as marketing goes. I don't know. I mean, Mark, maybe you want to jump in, but I don't think there's anything else marketing wise that would apply to.
Yeah, I think you're taking on a big risk if you start changing your policies now. I mean, yeah, as Brian said, you don't want to get into legal stuff, but you start changing rules at the last second. This goes also for pricing. If you got a dynamic pricing system, I would turn that off so that your rates aren't jumping up all of a sudden. You don't want to be perceived as taking advantage of a negative situation to profit or take advantage of people. So, yeah, I agree with Brian.
Yeah, that's a good point on the dynamic pricing piece. This next question is
sorry,
an
David, I just
question.
wanted to jump in real quick. I didn't mean to talk over you, but just one more thing that I had talked about with Amy Wirtz and other things is start thinking ahead now to, you can change your cancellation policy for reservations that aren't made already. So now that you know that this virus is a possibility and pandemics are a possibility, maybe start considering putting in things like a force majeure clause going forward.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I'll pose that question to Christine as well so that we can get that answered in our follow-up. Okay, so this next question is an insurance question for you and Chris and Irene. Will insurance cover me for a shutdown if a civil authority in my area requires I am shut down?
Generally, no. Generally excluded. If you think that you might have a claim because there's a shutdown, I recommend that you call your insurance agent and that you put in a claim for the insurance carrier to review your specific policy and your specific order and your specific situation. But generally speaking, viruses will exclude coverage. Still, I think it is worth it to put the claim in and see how the review of the claim is resolved.
Yeah, this is Chris. I'm going to echo what Irene just said. However, I'm also going to say that it really depends on your policy. So we know of probably a dozen different carriers that are active in the campground marketplace. And I've reviewed some that don't have a virus exclusion, but they also don't have a governmental action inclusion. And then I've also seen ones where they have the virus exclusion. So it really depends on your particular policy. And so giving an answer to that, you know, Irene's going to answer on her experience with the carrier she's dealt with. I'm going to answer the experience that I've dealt with. But Lord only knows what carrier is actually on the policy.
Chris, just to ask you a question, I had a super casual conversation with Damien at the Colorado Association. Definitely not anything scientific, but maybe you and Irene can give your take on this. What about travel insurance and purchasing it for your guests as a blanket policy for cancellations?
Well, that would indemnify the guest.
Well, Damien and I were talking, Damien specifically, and again, there's no research that's gone into this. It was a super casual conversation, but he mentioned that he might be able to work with somebody to purchase a blanket travel insurance policy for your campground if there was mass cancellations that you could then claim as a hardship against you. And again, I'm not an expert, but.
Well, generally speaking, it's hard to insure a barn that's on fire.
Now, and yeah, again, this was a March 1st conversation before the world was, normal back then. So, but.
Well said, Chris. It's hard to insure a barn that's on fire.
There might be a product that comes out of this going forward. And I wanted to talk about something else also we struggle sometimes as insurance professionals getting our clients to just insure the basics because many of them are very small businesses. We deal with an awful lot of customers, and a lot of them are mom and pops with a few work campers helping them. And so one thing I wanted to bring up, if ARVC could take a lead on helping develop some of these policies that we all reference that you should have, because if it's mom and pop and they're trying to sanitize every hour and they're trying to do all these.
Did we lose Chris?
I think we did. He was last I heard him say he was looking for policies for campgrounds with COVID-19. And David, I think that's challenging. This is Irene speaking, to have a universal policy because of the fact that the regulatory requirements are different, so many different places. So I'm working on developing a COVID-19 campground toolkit that helps campgrounds have at least a framework to reference the current regulations and then apply current rules to their park. And, I think that you can get a lot out of listening to these calls and all of the resources and formulate policies, but we're also very much individuals in this industry, and what's going on in Texas is different than what's in New York. So we have to take that into account as well. And public safety should always be the first priority. Don't be afraid to err on the side of caution, I would say. From a risk management standpoint, you close things if you need to, and give yourself that permission, adjust your operations, give yourself that permission. That's what leaders do, make hard decisions.
This is Chris. I'm back. Can you hear me?
Hey, Chris. Yeah, we lost you there, so we moved on, but go ahead and tell us what you were saying.
Well, what I was saying is we're dealing with, can you hear me? Okay. What I was saying is that we're dealing with a lot of small businesses, and if ARVC could help with some sort of base template for these policies and procedures that we all reference that you should have, that would probably help a lot of the smaller parks. Now I've forgotten what the question was that I was answering. It was travel insurance, I believe. There may come a product out of this. My expectation is that because the impacted event, so insurance, the basics of insurance is many people pay premiums so that a few people can have coverage when a loss occurs, whether it's property or liability. Okay, right now, pretty much the entire industry is having a loss. So what do you charge for that? And I just think it's going to get very expensive.
Yeah. I have another insurance question here that involves. Let me just read it here. I know that most insurance loss of business coverage states that losses due to the virus are not covered. However, if we are mandated to close by governmental policy, stay-at-home orders, etc., would it be advisable to file a claim anyway? I've heard that there may be action taken later to compel insurance companies to cover certain losses due to closures. What do you guys think about that?
This is Irene. I think that you should file a claim. Every policy is individual. Even a carrier, the same pet carrier can issue two different policies with two different endorsements on it. So just understand that I don't want you to be disappointed if you get a declination. It's unlikely for most people that these things are going to be covered. However, it's a good practice to put a claim in. Go ahead. We don't know, and I don't know if anyone who read the regulations, is there anything in applying for disaster assistance that's requiring that you get a rejection of an insurance claim for loss of business income? That's a thought too. And then to speak to the fact that some states, New Jersey, I know was one of them, was considering requiring insurance companies to pay for virus-related losses, including shutdowns by civil authority. The buzz in the industry is that that's probably unlikely to happen, and that's because insurance is there for the social well-being of society, and if we have not charged the premium for a possible loss, and as Chris mentioned, this is a widespread loss, there has been no premium collected to pay out the losses of those who are damaged, and therefore it could be very financially detrimental to the insurance industry. It also violates the existing contracts of contract law that is an insurance policy that has the exclusion on there. So I don't think that we're going to wind up going down that road. I could be wrong. I think that the policies are going to stand as they are. However, you should go back to the beginning. If you think you have a loss, put in a claim, let it go through the process. Just understand, in most cases, it's unlikely that virus coverage for loss of business income is going to be covered. Talk to your agent. Like Chris said, maybe there are some extensions on your particular policy. So I hope that helps.
And it's important to remember that an insurance contract is a private contract between you, your business, and an insurance company. So if the government came in, that would be changing contract law under the 5th, 14th Amendments of the U.S. Constitution, plus also violation probably of the state constitution. So I don't see that probably actually succeeding. If it does, in those states that it does, you're going to see massive increases in premium.
All right, I know we have Paul Bosley needs to drop off the call here in a second. So I'm going to pose one last business question to you, Paul, before we lose you. And this question was specific to a bill that they are faced with, but it really could be any expense. And the question is, will things like cable bills, internet bills, those kinds of things that are the day-to-day operation of a campground need to be paid while they're not open, or can they, it may be more of a legal question, but can they not pay those and get by, or is it advisable to pay them and then go, include those things in assistance programs down the road, you think?
My attitude would be you pay them and then you try to see if you apply for this new legislation. Once it finally passes, you see what parts of it that you're going to be able to get a grant for, which is still an open issue. But in the end, whatever vendor that you have has their own agreement that exists between you and the vendor, whether it's a personal bill that you're just paying through the business, which is probably the case in most campground owners, I would imagine. Or in some cases, if the campground has been incorporated for a long period of time, it might just be a bill to the business. So I think you have to defer your that answer to whatever the agreement is that exists between you and that given vendor that you're getting the bill from. But at least what our company's doing is we're just paying all the bills as they come in. And if there's things that we have the ability to pay a smaller amount, then we're just paying the smaller amount until the dust settles. Hello?
Sorry,
Yeah, I heard you, Chris.
I was on mute, sorry. I had a follow-up question to that, Paul, if you've got time. Is there any nationwide relief that you're aware of for credit card processor fees specifically? We've got a number of campgrounds here who have had negative feedback for the charges that they've had to charge based on those refunds. Have you heard anything about that?
I haven't seen anything like that at all, although the new bill I've separated the synopsis into business issues and personal issues. So after I hang up, what I'll do is early today, I'll email you this Word document, which breaks out into different issues like that, just so you can separate the information between personal and business. But I haven't seen anything like that at all. I think I know what I've been getting from everybody that we're doing business with is different emails on their own policy. So I think if you get an email from, like, for instance, we use Bank America as a processor. And I received an email about 3 or 4 days ago saying they were not going to charge us any merchant fees at all for the month of April. It was just a 30-day waiver. So depending who your processor is, you may have a similar situation to that. If you're using Bank America just by happenstance, you're not going to have any processing fees at all in the month of April.
So good advice to check with the processing company then on that one.
Yep.
And Paul, I know you have to drop off, so thank you for joining us. As we said with Christine, we've got a few other SBA specific questions here. I'll send them to you after the webinar, and then we can get those those answers posted to the website. Thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome. I'm on 2 other panels today in the fitness industry. So what I'm going to do is I usually try to answer, as you know, all the questions if I can before I call it a day. So it might be later today.
All right, sounds good. The life of an expert. All right. Thanks, Paul. This next question goes to you, Patrick. What industry do you recommend campgrounds use as a benchmark on when it will be safe and responsible for us to open up again? And how will we know when it will be safe to open facilities and amenities?
Restaurants. Restaurants are a really good metric because it's fluid. 1 out of every 10 people in the United States works in food service. And when I say that, I don't mean things like manufacturing. I'm talking about people who work directly in service sequencing of food. So they work as chefs, they work as waiters, they work as all that. And I give you that statistic simply because that ends up becoming the litmus test for the common spaces of America as to when they're going to reopen. And that's very unofficial, but essentially the economic metric goes something like this. If you're able to visit restaurants and you're able to interact with people as often as a waiter or a waitress would, then other common spaces are going to become more available. And the other thing I'm going to say is, too, the other reason why I use restaurants specifically is because they have so much influence now nationally. In almost every state, they have a massive, not almost every state, I'm sorry, in every state, they have a massive lobbying effort because they need to get the restaurants reopened because they live on very thin profit margins. And so they are the ones that are, their business models are extremely inelastic. And at this point with delivery, most restaurants are barely making any money. In fact, a lot of the restaurants that we work with, we've asked them, you know, if they're actually profiting off of it. And every single restaurant we spoke to said that essentially they're just breaking even. They're hoping to that the delivery just helps them to break even. So when they start to reopen restaurants, when they start to do that, that's when you're going to start to see, that's when you'll know that other common spaces are going to open up. The other one, actually, interestingly enough, is Disneyland. If Disneyland begins to reopen, where if these other common areas where there are a large number of folks who congregate, then that's when other companies are going to begin to start reopening, because especially large corporations are really good for this kind of thing, because they have professional business continuity and emergency response professionals who sit on FEMA's council. So they actually get information directly from FEMA, as we do, because we work with so many small businesses. And when they start to say the threat levels, regardless of the cacophony that you hear in the news, all that aside, with the information that we're seeing now, these are the best informed choices that you can make. And then once that starts to reopen, you'll see a general relaxation of things. As a matter of fact, already we're starting to see a lot of pushback because President Trump made it very clear that he wants the country to reopen. And I think the time period that he set up is probably aggressive, probably too aggressive. I think that the pendulum starts to swing, and that's really the way it always is. If you guys remember, after 9/11, it was such that they shut down air travel, and they eventually said, you can't have air travel shut down for weeks at a time, even though the threat level was the same when they reopened air travel as it was after 9/11. It was exactly the same. So when those kinds of things, so I tell people, really look at restaurants, and then, as I said, Disneyland is always a great place, because as soon as they start to reopen, then you'll start to see other common areas opening as well. But that, again, totally unofficial, but those are places that, in my opinion, have business models that are extremely inelastic and are therefore require common areas to reopen for them to operate properly. When that starts to happen, I think you're going to start to see the paradigm shift a little bit back to a normal state of doing the business.
Patrick, I'm going to stick with you, and this might be a legal question as well, but I'm going to pose it to you. Would it be too much to screen people who visit and might seem sick? What do we do then? And do, would you recommend turning those people away because they show signs and symptoms, even though it could, on a previous webinar, I think you mentioned somebody who showed signs and symptoms, but as it turns out, they were having an asthma attack or an allergy attack. Mm-hmm. What would you recommend there?
Actually, that's a really great point. One of the things that I can't speak from a legal perspective, because I'm going to give this general disclaimer, which is it really depends on your own local laws. So with that proviso in place, let me say this, which is you should always screen people who are coming into the park. Now, I don't know the legalities of every state. So as I said, if somebody else hops on and says, well, in my state, you're not allowed to do that, that's fine. But from an emergency management perspective, you need to be watching people who are entering the park. You need to watch people who are coming into work. I got a lot of emails after our last webinar, and people were asking me, should I screen my employees? Yes, and not only should you screen employees, you should have a specific place where you screen them, so that it's not just, well, they just came on and I'm just going to screen them over here, talk with them. You literally should have a place, and I tell this to employers all the time, you need to have a specific chair, a specific place where they sit, where you talk with them and you screen them before they come into the restaurant, the park, whatever business it is, because you don't want people entering your workspaces if you don't know if they're ill or not. And again, I know that Christine was talking about that there are some complexities, because with employment law, and this really it depends on the industry, right? It depends on the status of that person, right? If they're an independent contractor, I mean, I know some parks, for example, that they have horse trainers. As a matter of fact, I was working with a park in Santa Barbara. They have horse trainers who come on, and they are 1099 employees. And in California, if you have a 1099 employee, you can screen them. And if they do not have, if you believe that they're sneezing, that they're sick, you can send them home. You don't have to ask any questions. So those are the ways. So as I said, everybody's going to be a little bit different, but you should screen people. And that's one of the reasons why I believe that there has to be some kind of interpersonal interaction with anyone who enters your park, period. Even with vendors. I was mentioning this too, which is if you have vendors who come into your park, the actual person who is going to be, if you're still having vendor visits, then you need to screen them before they come in, because again, an uncontrolled situation where you have one person coming in, now they're interacting with dozens of people perhaps, can go from a small problem to a larger problem. So, so in deference to what Christy was saying, is that you need to consult with an attorney, but the one thing, as I said, we've said this many times, which is you need to have your written policies in place. I agree with what Mark and Brian have said, which is you need to lay the policy out. You need to make sure it is clearly communicated to everybody, because people are going to ask, why did you screen these people, but you didn't screen these other people? So that has to be 100% clear, so that the parks policy is universally applied, so that if you have, but the screening policy should, the last thing that I'll say too before I surrender the floor is this, is that if you're going to screen people, that's fine, but you need to have a metric in place of how you will do that. So what is that going to be? So what are you going to say? And I know we talked about this a little while ago, a couple of webinars ago, was that you need to specifically say, if these things are true, then we're going to turn this person away, whatever that is, employer, vendor, whatever. You need to have that in place so that you aren't just saying, well, I guess this person looks sick, because you guys are not doctors, right? So you have to, whatever that is, make sure that that is being applied every single time, and having someone make sure they're trained, make sure that you have a plan in place for it. And in the app, for example, we've actually laid out the calculus for it, and then just actually follow that process for every single person who enters the park.
So that's a template, Patrick, that is available on the Disaster Hawk app? Yes, it is. We've actually laid out a few things where we said for employees who are coming on duty, here's a few things, because I know a bunch of you emailed me and said, hey, can you give me a sample one? Well, we've actually placed it in the app so that you can actually say, if somebody comes in, here's what you should assess for, and you should actually read this policy word for word. And we've actually laid out the entire thing, so that it's very clear. And again, consult with an attorney, but before you do any of this, because you don't want to make sure that you are running afoul of any employment laws. But from an emergency management perspective, that's how we feel about it. So, okay. I've got a sanitation question here in terms of, many parks have sewage dump stations, and the disinfectants that the CDC is suggesting using, like bleach, can harm the good bugs in septic systems. So is there a recommendation that you're aware of, Patrick, or anyone else on the call, for methods that folks are using to sanitize and disinfect surfaces around these sewage dump stations?
I actually had something that someone emailed me. Mark, I know that you're in a lot of parks. Have you seen anything specifically? I actually have a product that I heard about, and I'm going to look it up in the email right now while you're speaking and pull it up. But have you heard anything or seen anything?
No, not specifically yet. And it's funny because I was actually at the store buying some cleaning products, and I had the choice between the holistic natural kind and the kind that had the double shot of bleach. And I just went to the double shot of bleach because I was like, well, I don't want to die, right? And so we're in an uncharted area right now, so I don't want to advise anybody pro or con. I will be talking to some folks from AWS here I think later today. So I should have some better information later today.
Yeah, and the ones I'm seeing here, the one that he sent me, actually, I'm sorry, I was wrong. It wasn't for that. It was specifically for a laundry room. I apologize. But But yeah, there isn't anything that I know about specifically, but I will keep an eye out on it, and I will, I'll ask some parks if they have any specific best practices, and I'll make sure that at the end, I'll email the answer to that question. I will look into this right away.
I'm sure we have people on the call who are curious to know what that laundry room product is too. Do you want to shout that out?
Yeah, they were using a product called, oh great, you guys have probably used it before. They're using a basic stearamine solution. Let's see. He says that he's using right now is a stearamine solution with 4 tablets plus 2 gallons of water, and I don't know if that is what others should be using. I haven't really looked at it. As I said, someone just emailed that to me this morning, so I will glance into it. But as I said, I'll try to get some better answers for everybody. So I'll kind of do a poll out with some of our clients and see what I can find out, because I'm happy to provide that to you guys.
Okay. Any recommendations on kind of a similar situation regarding money and the germs that are on money? I know a lot of parks are using mobile payments, credit card payments, and that kind of thing. But for things that do require money, I know a lot of laundry facilities require quarters and that kind of stuff. Is there a recommendation at all in sanitizing the money before it recycles?
No. One of the things that, and the CDC has been very clear on this, is one of the few things they've been very unambiguous about, which is great, because obviously cash, there's a lot of areas in the country where cash is huge, which is cash. If you're going to handle cash, if it's possible, you should do really one of 2 or 3 different things. First is that you should, if they're buying a product, like they're buying an item in the store, which I know that most places have already closed their stores. I understand that, but some still have cash being exchanged. Is that you should have them place the money in an envelope, so that they're actually placing the cash in an envelope and handing it to you, and then you're handing them cash that's in the register or whatever, so that exchange isn't occurring. This especially is the case where you don't have a lot of gloves, which really comes to solution number 2, which is really what a lot of industries are using, which is they just say wear gloves. You should wear gloves whenever you touch cash, because if you're going to touch cash, you need to realize I think most people forget the fact that cash is made of cotton. I mean, there's cotton in the actual cash itself, so in the actual dollar bills. So it can transmit a lot of and retain a lot of different pathogens over time, and people are obviously handling it with their bare hands. This is also true, obviously, of coinage. So one of the things that they also say is that if you're going to use gloves, you need to have a lot of disposable gloves, so that when you're touching cash, whenever you finish the transaction, you're then if you're going to continue to handle cash, that's fine. But the minute you start doing anything other than accepting cash, then you have to change your gloves out. So one of the things that restaurants have done, for example, especially with deliveries, which is they have one person who, that's all they do is touch the cash, and then they have somebody else who's handing the delivery driver food, so that there's never an issue regarding someone holding cash who's touching anything else. And the final solution, of course, is going cashless entirely, which a lot of businesses have gone to. Obviously, that may be impossible in your own individual parks, but those are really the 3 major methods. But no matter what, and I know this is a common refrain and it's going to become a massive cliche, obviously, is if you are handling cash, you're in a situation where you are touching cash every time, and there is no exceptions to this policy, none, never, 0. Anytime you touch cash, you must wash your hands immediately afterward. There is no exceptions to this policy. If you touch cash, you immediately must wash your hands. I'm very thankful the CDC has not changed their guidance on this at all, because there are so many pathogens that could be on both dollar bills as well as the actual coinage itself. So you really have to kind of modify your operations a little bit. So however you're handling that, if you're handing out coins and things, whatever that is, the policy has to be immediately after that, you need to wash your hands, because if you don't, you are running a significant risk of passing on and transmitting whatever was on the dollar bill to anything else and contaminating anything else in your operation.
All right, good advice. We are at our time limit for today's webinar, so I'm going to say we had a number of questions still out there, but many of them have been answered either on previous webinars or in our post-webinar answers that we are posting on the website. So I will say to those of you who maybe didn't get your question answered today, to go back and listen to those webinars. Start though by looking at the post-webinar questions, because many of them are answered in there. If for some reason though you don't see your question answered there, feel free to reach out to ARVC. Best way to do that would be at membership@arvc.org. That email will go to a number of people, and we can make sure that your specific question gets answered either between now and Monday's webinar or on Monday's webinar. So we definitely want to make sure that all the questions get answered in some way, shape, or form. Before we leave, though, I want to give the panelists an opportunity. If you have anything more that you'd like to put out there for the participants that we maybe didn't cover today, anything that anybody wants to mention that hasn't been talked about?
This is Irene. One thing that I think is a good idea for park owners to do now that is a timely issue. I was talking to Ann Backlund, who's an insurance agent with Marshall and Sterling, but she also runs a campground with her family. And this is something that she and her family have started to do, which is they run this whole park together. So they've started to break into pods. And these are all adults. So she's got her and her husband isolating in one house, an adult son and his wife in another house, an adult daughter and her partner in another house, a nephew in an additional location, and then a backup couple who can also run the campground down the road. And so they're not socializing so that they can back each other up. Heaven forbid somebody gets sick, there's not cross-contamination. So that, I think, is just something that's smart to think about as a risk management technique for your staffing.
Great advice. Anybody else on the panel before we close out?
This is Chris. We also have a toolkit and a carrier help numbers if you guys ever have any questions on our website.
And yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Chris. If any of the panelists have helpful links like that, go ahead and send them to me after the webinar, and I'll make sure they get posted. So to close us out, I want to remind everyone that we'll be back on this same channel on Monday at 11 a.m. If you'd like to join us again, the link that you used for today's webinar will work. And we'll continue that schedule of Monday, Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern until we get through this current situation. I want to also remind everyone again that these webinars are being recorded and the answers to open questions are posted on arvc.org/coronavirus. That is it for today's webinar. Thank you again to all of our panelists, and thank you all for joining us today. Be safe and be well.
Thank you.